My Irish friend Therese, who I'd met in Germany when I worked at the American Army Hospital, was there to greet me at Toronto Airport and drove me to a very affluent area of the city called Rosedale, not far from downtown. She shared the top floor of a large Edwardian-style house with 3 other girls, including Catherine, who I'd also met at the Army Hospital, so it was a nice reunion. Therese made a bed for me on her sofa and said I could stay with her until I found a place of my own. The next day I called Graham, the lawyer I'd met in Corfu and who'd sponsored me, and arranged to meet him at his law firm in downtown Toronto. Even though I'd been to London many times, Toronto seemed 10 times bigger and was very imposing with its huge skyscrapers. But with Therese's guidance, I was able to find the prestigious Blake Castles in Graydon, which was located on 6 floors of a very modern high-rise building. It was great seeing Graham again, although I hardly recognised him in his smart pinstripe suit, shiny shoes and short haircut. I could easily have passed him on the street and I wouldn't have recognised him. I think he felt the same way about me too. It was clear that we weren't beach bums anymore, but responsible grown-ups. He took me to the personnel department where I completed the necessary paperwork and arranged to start work the following Monday. However, I wouldn't be working for Graham, but would be a floater for a couple of weeks, a bit like a temp, before I was assigned to a particular lawyer. Well, that was okay with me, because at least I could get my feet wet. Oh, so I thought. Admittedly, I wasn't in a good headspace when I started working at the law firm, but I really didn't like being there. It was so impersonal, and with over 400 employees, it was a complete contrast to the solicitors I worked for in Coventry, where there were only 10 of us in a beautiful old Victorian house. I went from working in a cosy room of a house filled with antiques, large windows facing a garden of trees, and a fireplace that burnt warm and bright in the winter, to a desk in a small cubicle in a modern high-rise building. Instead of sitting opposite my best friend Mandy, with whom I'd shared the office for 6 years, I now faced a blank wall and was far away from a window. Each morning, an audio tape was placed on top of my typewriter. I transcribed the tape, then placed the finished work in a folder and left that on top of my typewriter for pickup. It was repeated the next day and the day after that. I hardly saw anyone, and quite honestly, I wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone at all or make friends. Now, this is me, Marie, the people person I'm describing here. As much as I tried to cover it up, it was very obvious that I was depressed. I was also having periods of paranoia, not part of my personality at all. For instance, whenever I went anywhere on the subway with Therese, I'd get terrible bouts of claustrophobia, and I'd cling onto her arm in desperation. I felt I was suffocating. When she took me to her favourite Irish pub, the Man of Arran, I couldn't bear to be inside with the customers. I'd have a panic attack and run outside because I was having difficulty breathing. "What's wrong with you?" Therese would say in her lovely, lilting Irish accent. "I can't stand being with all those people, Therese." It only occurred to me much later that the distress I was feeling was related to my brother's death. You see, because I needed to be strong and be there for my mother and the rest of the family, I hadn't allowed myself to grieve. I suppose someone else might have considered seeing a therapist to talk to, but it never crossed my mind. Also, it was only crazy people who did that, and I knew I wasn't crazy. Well, at least Therese and Catherine assured me of that. After 6 weeks at the law firm and feeling no happier, I handed in my notice and got a new job working for a public relations firm. Now this was more up my alley. There was a lot more interaction with people, and I enjoyed helping to promote sports events such as downhill skiing, motor racing and golf classics. I particularly liked the press conferences though, and was fascinated by the camera crews from the various television stations. It all seemed so glamorous and exciting, and I knew then that I wanted a career in television. In the meantime, while I was settling into my new job, I still wasn't feeling quite right within myself, but that soon changed. One day, Therese took me to her favourite boutique, where the clothes were imported from Europe. It was run by two very handsome French-Canadian brothers from Montreal. As I was looking through a selection of gorgeous blouses, one of the brothers came up to me. "You're beautiful," he said. Right. Now that's a great line, guaranteed to make a sale, I thought. Then he looked into my eyes and said something along the lines that it was the beauty inside that he was seeing. Well, that really made me feel good. So cancel that sale. Then he went on to talk about the potential we all have within us and the power of the subconscious mind to realise that potential. He talked about the many hidden dimensions and capabilities of the mind, not only to achieve, but to heal. He was clearly not there to sell clothes. What he was selling was a 4-day PSI mind development seminar, and I was hooked. Yes, he was handsome, but it was the intensity and sincerity of his words that intrigued me. Interestingly, he'd ignored Therese and somehow picked up on my vulnerability, my fragility, my need, perhaps. He invited me to an introductory talk being given a few days later at the Four Seasons Hotel, and I couldn't wait to attend. Therese, though, was suspicious of the whole thing and said she'd go along with me just to make sure it wasn't a white slave market. The talk was given by the leader of PSI, Joe DuPont, who hailed from Switzerland. He was a fairly short and slightly overweight man in his late 40s with greased back, brown, thinning hair. But despite the fact that he could easily have passed for a used car salesman, Joe was very charismatic. He had the most intense and hypnotic eyes, which, combined with his Swiss accent, made him very attractive. He wore a white suit, and diamond rings glittered on his fingers as he revved up the audience with promises of releasing the unknown powers of the mind. What he and the PSI graduates, who he called disciples, were selling was a 4-day course that was guaranteed to change our lives. Very similar to the Silver Mind Method and other self-help and meditation programs that emerged in the 70s, PSI claimed to increase an individual's abilities through relaxation, development of higher brain functions, and psychic abilities such as clairvoyance. Joe DuPont had apparently revised the objective of the original PSI group to include psychic healing, a demonstration of which was going to be the highlight of the evening. Audience members were asked to fill out a card with the name, age, and location of someone who needed healing. Also writing on the card the particular illness that person was dealing with. I wrote down the name and age of my brother, Peter, where he lived, and his medical issue, diabetes. We handed the completed cards to the disciples who circled the room, and they gave the cards to Joe on stage. He asked a young woman in the audience to pick a card from the deck, while a PSI graduate, a young man, let's call him Larry, walked onto the stage and sat facing the audience with his back to a blackboard. Joe told Larry the name, age, and location written on the chosen card, which he then wrote on the blackboard for the audience to see. He also wrote the medical condition, but at no time was this information visible to Larry. Joe then instructed him to go into an altered or meditative state, and within a minute or two, Larry looked very relaxed. Then, with his eyes closed, he began to see or visualize the person listed on the card. Then, using his hands in front of him, proceeded to scan every single part of this man's body, looking for health problems. There was a history of a broken leg, he said, skin issues. His lungs were black. He was a smoker. None of which were written on the blackboard or on the card. But the audience member who'd submitted it nodded her head to say, yes, that was correct. Then we were all astonished when Larry held the imaginary person's heart in his hands. I know, it sounds weird. But in his altered state, Larry said, "This man has a big heart. I can hardly hold it." Everyone laughed because it seemed pretty ridiculous. But we were all totally captivated. He went on to say, he's a kind man, but he has cardiovascular disease, which was exactly the condition written on the blackboard. Joe told him that was right, and Larry then proceeded to massage the heart with a healing balm, all in his imagination, of course. We were blown away by this performance and trying to figure out how Larry did it. When Joe said that we are all capable of psychic healing and so much more, that we had no idea how powerful we were, how amazing we were, I knew I had to sign up for the 4-day course, and it did change my life. Next time, euphoria and then awakening to the PSI cult.